Well, hello there, and welcome to our next installment of Something Like a Sermon. Today we'll be in Mark chapter 9, and looking at a really important text as we wrap up our series during the time of Epiphany. And today we'll have a very important epiphany about who Jesus is. Before that, I just want to mention if there's anyone out there who's interested in the mountaintop experience, there are some pretty good mountains of snow right around our church building in that area. So the plows have done a good job of making some good mountains of snow, and very enjoyable for kids. Our kids had a blast on them the other day, so kids and adults alike, it's a good time. So anyone who's interested in the mountaintop experience, I would encourage you to go for that. Speaking of mountaintop experiences, that's the sort of thing that we're going to look at today in Mark chapter 9, and it's the text about the Transfiguration of Jesus. Several months ago, we looked at another mountaintop experience in 1 Kings chapter 19, and that had to do with Elijah, and we saw there echoes and parallels between Elijah on Mount Sinai and Moses before him, and how they both had a really important encounter with God there on the mountain. Well, both of those serve as sort of a backstory echoing of what we're going to see in Mark chapter 9 in the Transfiguration. In fact, even the very first phrase that we'll look at here in Mark chapter 9 verse 2 says, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. And that phrase, 6 days later, automatically calls to mind this really important story in Exodus chapter 24 that we would have read today during our worship service. In Exodus 24, there's a ton of parallels between what happens there and what happens here in the Transfiguration of Jesus. It's this really awesome story about Moses and a select group of people, and there's this scene where they see God face to face and eat with him. There's Moses waiting to be called up the mountain by God, and he waits for 6 days, just like Jesus and the disciples had waited in this place for 6 days, and then after 6 days, Moses is called by God. There's been this cloud that's consumed the mountain, the presence of the Lord, and Moses is there, and he gets called up to encounter God in that powerful moment. And that's just a little piece, a little echo of the parallel here between the Transfiguration of Jesus and the things that it's calling to mind in Old Testament texts. There's tons of echoes, tons of parallels between what happens here in the scene of the Transfiguration in Mark chapter 9 and other things that happen not only in the Bible but in Jewish literature of the time in general. So we already talked about how there's going to be strong parallels, echoes of Elijah, stuff about Moses, there's stuff about Adam and these legends of these shining, radiant garments that Adam had, and all that ties into sort of this messianic expectation, what the Messiah is going to look like. There's ties to Sinai, ties to the Garden of Eden, because those are also related in Scripture. There's ties to the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, and that's just like scratching the surface. There's so much here to mine as far as the echoes, the symbolism, the theology of the text. I'm not going to do all that. I just want you to be aware that you could spend an afternoon or two looking into that, and it's super interesting. But we'll stick to some of the main things here. The most obvious ones that have to do with Moses and Elijah, who are the two characters, the two people that appear on the mountain with Jesus. So if you haven't been through the text already, it's Mark chapter 9, verse 2, and we're just going to cover the first 13 verses. But you know the story. It's 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and he took them up on the high mountain by themselves. And then the text says he was transfigured before them. And a lot of that is left to our imagination, except for there's a description here in verse 3 that says, his garments became radiant and exceedingly white, as no launder on earth could whiten them. So this isn't like some super bleach that did the trick. There's something happening here that's supernatural, is the point. That this isn't, that what's happening here is the glory, or the radiant glory of the Lord that's shining out from Jesus here, at least in his clothes. And Mark mentioned specifically just his clothes. If you read another gospel, you might see that Jesus' face is shining, which gives an even fuller echo of something about Moses and his encounters with God. But Mark talks about his garments being radiant and exceedingly white. And then verse 4, if that wasn't cool enough, verse 4, Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Mark doesn't give us a whole lot of insight into what they're saying. The point is that he's talking with Moses and Elijah. That's awesome enough. And there's some discussion about what does it mean that Elijah is with Moses. Is that just a phrase that could mean that, hey, that's just how we describe Moses and Elijah in the same place? Or does it mean that one is subordinate to the other? Is Elijah with Moses? Is Elijah the plus one? Is Moses subordinate to Elijah? There's a lot of discussion about that, about what the point might be. But either way, Elijah and Moses, that's pretty cool company. And Jesus is there with them. And you know that there's important texts about their exit in their last days from earth. Moses famously buried by God, but there's other traditions that and rumors that arise where Moses might have not died at all. He might have been similar to Elijah. Both of them are taken to heaven, and so there's some of that in the background here too. But the main point is Moses and Elijah. Now, I don't know what you would do if you saw Jesus and Moses and Elijah up on the mountain, but this is what Peter did. He said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So obviously there's a million different opinions and ways to interpret this text as well. Mark tells us in the very next verse, Peter didn't really know what to answer here. He was just saying something because they were all freaked out. They were terrified at what was happening. Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus, and he was talking to him. Peter didn't know what to say, so he says this. Now you see that there's ties, and Peter might have in mind some sort of tabernacle and end times imagery that's combined in their theology, and so maybe that's why he's referencing the tabernacles. Maybe we don't give Peter enough credit for what he was trying to say here and the point he was trying to make. Maybe there is a really important point to be made about the Feast of Tabernacles and building tabernacles for Jesus and Moses and Elijah. But either way, however that conversation might have gone, and however mistaken or not Peter was in this context, that's sort of just a passing moment, and Peter's words sort of give way to this next scene in verse 7, that there's a cloud and a voice. And this is the point of the text. A cloud and a voice. The cloud formed, overshadowed them, protected them, and their voice comes out from the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Now, we've encountered a voice and a message very much like that early on in the first chapter of Mark's Gospel at the baptism of Jesus. And if you remember that text, there is this message that was given only to Jesus. You are my Son. Here is a slightly more public message, "This is my son," and then second message, "Listen to him." Jesus is the one that they are called to listen to over and against whatever other voices, whatever other teaching that there might be. Jesus is the one that is God's beloved Son. This is the great epiphany, the great revelation. Jesus is the Son of God, and it's his voice that the disciples, that we are called to listen to. And that's the overall message here. And all at once, in verse 8, they looked around and saw no one with them anymore except Jesus. So this great scene, this great vision comes to an end as quickly as it came into being, and then everything is back to normal, and all of a sudden it's just Jesus. On the heels of hearing that message and that proclamation, "This is my son, listen to him," they look around once again and see that it's just them and just Jesus alone. And that's the end of the scene, which is an interesting ending. The next thing we see them doing is in verse 9, coming down from the mountain. So who knows what happened and how that all went down while they're still on top of the mountain. We don't hear Jesus saying anything to them yet, although we're supposed to be listening. So we don't know what was said just yet. But the next thing we know about them is that they're coming down from the mountain, and now Jesus tells them, here's his voice, he gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. So he's talking to them directly. First of all, that messianic secret that we discussed last time, and then a direct reference to the Son of Man rising from the dead. This is the thing that they're to listen to Jesus about most importantly. Until the Son of Man rose from the dead. Now, Jesus told them about that, and verse 10, they seized upon this statement. They grabbed a hold of it. They couldn't let go. What does this mean? So they start discussing with one another what is meant by the rising from the dead. What is Jesus talking about? Now, that's what they were thinking. That's what they were discussing among themselves. They didn't say that stuff to Jesus. Verse 11, what they said to Jesus was not the resurrection stuff. That's what they talked about by themselves. But what they said out loud to Jesus is said, "Why is it that the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Now, it might sound like these two things are unrelated, but they're really both about the last days and the end times and that sort of thing. They want to know. I mean, it's not like they don't know what the rising from the dead means. They just don't understand what Jesus is saying about it and the way that he's talking about it, referring to the Son of Man. Everyone knows that in the last days there's resurrection from the dead. But there's some interesting stuff that Jesus is saying, applying just directly individually to him. And that's sort of a weird way to talk about resurrection, because resurrection is a general event. It's for everyone all at the same time. But then there's discussion of individual Son of Man rising, and that is curious to them. And so they ask him, though, about what is this teaching of the scribes about that Elijah must come first. And then let's just see what Jesus says to them real quick here, verses 12 and following. "Elijah does come first and restore all things, and yet how is it written of the Son of Man that he will suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has indeed come, and they did to him whatever they wished, just as it is written to him, just as it is written of him." Okay, what does that mean? What does that mean? Elijah is supposed to come. This is a great text at the very end of Malachi, that Elijah is supposed to come and bring about this great restoration and reconciliation in the land. All right? And that is supposed to usher in the end days. Now, eventually, that becomes associated with the Messiah as well. So, not only does Elijah come before the last day, but before the day of the Lord, but Elijah then is seen to come before the Messiah, and the Messiah ushers in the last days and that sort of thing. But what is Elijah supposed to do. He's supposed to bring about this great scene of peace, of reconciliation, of joy. It's supposed to be like this awesome moment. And Jesus says Elijah does first come and restore all things. But and this is why the disciples are questioning this, because there's already a huge reinterpretation underway about the Messiah and messianic expectation. There's a huge reinterpretation that the Messiah is actually going to suffer and he's going to die. Well, now Jesus introduces a reinterpretation of this same thing about Elijah. If you think about it, if Elijah comes in and just restores everything and makes it great and perfect, then why would there be a situation where the Messiah comes right after him, and what would have happened that the Messiah would suffer and die if he enters into this golden age of peace and restoration and that sort of thing? Why would he be suffering there? So there's a lot of confusion on the part of the disciples, on the part of anyone else who's trying to read and understand here. But Jesus seems to be reinterpreting not just messianic expectations on the part of the disciples, but also all of it, including the Elijah stuff. Yeah, Elijah does come to restore all things, but actually Elijah has come. This is an obvious reference to John the Baptist. And if you look at John the Baptist, there's real clear allusions to the Elijah stuff. He's saying Elijah has come, and what happened with him? Was he celebrated? Was there some great restoration? No, they did to him whatever they wished, just as it was written of him. John the Baptist was martyred, beheaded. The expectation of Elijah was seemingly not fulfilled in him, but Jesus says it was. Elijah did come, and he was a suffering servant, just like the Messiah is going to be, and the Messiah will be even more so. So it's a huge reinterpretation of the Elijah stuff and the Messiah stuff, and all that's happening in this great epiphany and this discussion afterwards that's happened on the mountain, and more importantly, as they come down from the mountain where real life is going to be lived. And that's sort of the point that the disciples and Mark are making as we see this story, that the great epiphany occurs on the mountaintop. They have the great mountaintop experience, but then they don't stay on top of the mountain and just, delight and revel in the glory of the experience. That has to be lived out some way. And as cool as it is that Jesus' garments are shining and radiant, as cool as it is that he is the Messiah and the Son of God, that actually means something down on the ground at the base of the mountain in real life. And that means suffering, that means persecution, that means crucifixion, that means death, that means taking up the cross. And that's what Jesus' disciples are going to come to learn was true about the figure of Elijah that we see in John the Baptist, the figure of the Messiah, and it's going to be true of the disciples as well afterwards. It's important, this verse 8, as much comfort as we might find in the Elijah figure and the Moses figure, when it's all over, the one that's left there still with the disciples is Jesus. And that's a really important message for the disciples, that Jesus is there with them, that he's the one that's left, he's still by their side. Joel Marcus has some really good comments about that very point, and I want to end with just a short reading from Joel Marcus and his commentary on Mark, because he really talks about not just the cool part about what we come to find out about Jesus, but what that means for the disciples as well, what it means for Mark's readers. What does this story mean for the first people who ever heard this? The first readers of Mark's gospel, the recipients of Mark's gospel, lived in very difficult times. They lived in times of trials and tribulations and persecutions for their faith. And they readily identified so powerfully with the suffering servant of Jesus. And that was a very heartfelt and encouraging message for them, and gave them great encouragement. So Joel Marcus here in this commentary is going to talk about the impact and the message that this has for Mark's community as they read, as they study, and I want us to apply that to ourselves too. So we're kind of listening in with the first readers of Mark's gospel through their ears and their eyes, and seeing how the text applies to us. So we'll conclude with this. He's referring to verse 8 here. That concluding phrase, with them, that Jesus was with them, would reverberate loudly for the hard-pressed members of the Markan community. Unlike Moses and Elijah, Jesus did not belong only to the past and the future, but is presently with them. And just as their status as disciples means that they have been chosen by Jesus in order that they might be with him, so their election includes the privilege of having him with them, even in the midst of their suffering. In the Transfiguration, then, the Markan audience has been shown a vision of Jesus in his Adamic, messianic glory, a vision that counterbalances the strong emphasis in the preceding pericopes on the necessity of joining in Jesus' march to extinction. That's in Mark chapter 8, and maybe we'll circle back around to Mark chapter 8 in a future sermon, because that's a really important text here too. So in doing so, thus removing the offense of the cross from the disciples' heart. The Markan community may be called on to follow Jesus to death, but even as they do so, he will be with them, and the glory that he once displayed on the mountain will break forth for them for a time and time again, even at moments when they are so frightened that they do not know what to say. Blessings to you on this Lord's Day.